Thanks everybody for tuning in or for watching this after the fact. Like I said, my name is Josh Dzielak, and I have this weird title at Keen.io called Open Sorcerer that I cooked up for myself because it sounded fun, and it's kind of lightweight, and it does reflect a lot of what I do, which is just sort of focusing on the tooling in front of our API and the things that make the API useful across a variety of different programming languages and frameworks and developer communities, et cetera, et cetera. So today, what I'm going to start with, and I think maybe it'll take about 10 or 15 minutes, is just a very simple walkthrough of how to instrument something using Keen's JavaScript library, and then seeing how to create both a dashboard based on that, a very simple one, and also seeing how to get at that same data and run very similar queries from our command line interface and also from the workbench itself, which you actually find on Keen.io once you've signed up, once you've created an account. So this is the first time that I'm walking through this, so if there are any speed bumps, I apologize. But and I really encourage you to kind of jump in and unmute for those of you that are participating right now. And if there's anything that doesn't seem clear or we maybe want to dig into a little bit further, I think that's great, and it'll be super helpful for everybody who watches the video. So feel free to chime in, and I will probably be going back and forth a little bit between screen sharing and just the sort of video here. And so keep an eye out for that. If I forget to tune back to video, just shout at me. So we're going to go ahead and do a little screen share right now to get started. And okay, cool. So if the screen share is working, then all you're seeing is this Google Chrome browser window with a very simple web page loaded that says big red button. This big red button is the thing that we're going to instrument today. This is a deliberately very simple example. Sort of all we're going to care about, all we're going to wire up for analytics is just pressing this button. So it's totally contrived, totally simple example. But the reason I wanted a simple example is that we can, by keeping this part simple, it lets us look into a lot of the different operations that we can perform with Keen, just given, without, it gives us time to look at the workbench. It gives us time to look at the command line interface. It gives us time to look at how to make a dashboard. When we keep the thing that we're tracking really simple, then we can look at sort of all the layers in the stack, or all the ways that you get at the data, and eventually kind of how those become part of your solution. So if we look at what's on this web page, I'm going to go ahead and view some source. This stuff, and also a note, this whole demo, I will throw it up on GitHub pretty soon and send anyone here links to it so you can check it out and clone it yourself. Again, design it, get you sort of familiar with Keen, get you in the door, see a couple of the tools really, really quickly. So a lot of what we're going to do in the next few minutes is I'll just show you different parts of the code behind this stuff, which I think you'll find is pretty simple. And then we will also, obviously we'll press the button that will generate events, and then we will look at those events on a dashboard. We will look at those events on the command line. We'll look at those events in sort of on Keen.io itself. So you'll be able to see kind of the whole stack, the whole toolkit kind of play together. So here's our web page. I just viewed source for this page with a simple button. And if I look, I see a couple of things. First, here's obviously the little image tag that is our big red button. And we've included jQuery on the page for some convenience in locating elements. But the sort of Keen related part starts Here, where we're just taking basically a boilerplate JavaScript snippet that you'd find in the Keen JavaScript library documentation and just putting that on the page. And that's basically what goes and loads the Keen minified library from our CDN, and it gives you access to this Keen object right here. So after we've included that boilerplate, we have this one line of JavaScript where we're configuring an object called Keen client. And so we're saying var Keen client is a new Keen object. And when we configure it, we give it a project ID and a write key. You can think about the write key as an API key that you use to write to the project. With that key, you can't read from it. There's a separation of concerns in terms of the security when it comes to being able to write to collections or being able to read from them. So if someone has this key, they can write to the collection. And if you're doing web analytics, this is all out in JavaScript land. So anyone who views source will be able to get those keys. But they're only useful for adding events to the collections. Very much how you'd be used to web analytics, where there's sort of a unique identifier and anyone can write into it. Now, later on in a minute, we'll look at the corollary, which is the read key, and that's the thing that actually lets us pull information back out of the API, pull the events back and analyze them. So if we continue on, we just got a little sort of line by line click handler here for the big red button. So when we click it, we'll prevent its default behavior so we don't reload the page. It's inside of an anchor tag. But here's the really interesting thing. We're just going to make a call to the add event method on the Keen client that we configured and pass it a couple of parameters. The first one here is a string argument button presses, and that refers to the collection inside of the Keen project that you like to put this event into. You can think of it almost as an event type. You're trying to capture there what happened. So was a button, are these button presses? Common collection names might also be signups or logins, page views, things of that nature. And so projects within Keen are kind of a container of multiple collections, and usually you usually end up with a few collections or more, depending on what you can do. The nice thing about collections also is you do not have to create them in advance. They will just be created on the fly the first time you send an event. So I have a brand new project that I've created for us today, and it's totally has no data in it. So we'll see the first time we actually press a button, the collection will get created, and then we can go and look at it. So after the collection name button presses, there's two other arguments. The first one is just the set of properties that we want to attach to the event. So you can think of this as capturing state about the event, information about the event. If you were tracking a sign up, then this would be probably maybe a username, or maybe some kind of attributes about the user that help you identify where they came from or what their demographics were, so you can do analytics later or cohort analysis, things like that. Just sort of all of the things that are interesting about the event that you want to capture. So in our deliberately simple example, we have size and we have color. So the size is big. Let's see if we look back at our original page. Clearly says it's big and red. So the size is big and the color is red. Those are the only two properties that we're really going to care about. There are some other properties that get created behind the scenes by Keen that include timestamp and a unique ID. We'll look at those later. For now, just we're going to press a button that's big and red, and those are our properties. The last thing is simply a callback when the event is successfully sent to Keen. This callback will get triggered, and we're just going to replace some text and then refresh the page. So let's go ahead and try it out. We'll flip back over here and go ahead and open the console and open it to the network tab so that we can actually see what happens when we press it. So here we go. I'm going to go ahead and press the button, and sure enough, we've been told the page will self-destruct in 5 seconds. And for a moment there, you could see there was a JSON-P web request. I think it was JSON-P that went through and basically sent that event in. So I hit it again, and now I've hit it a total of 2 different times. And theoretically, we should have 2 events inside of our keen button presses collection. So how do we go and look at that? How do we verify that? How do we see what those events were? How do we look at the properties? Do we, can we confirm it was a big and red button that was actually pressed? So the way that we do that, there's going to be 3 different ways, as I'm alluded to before. Here the view you're seeing right now is called the workbench. That's something on keen.io. When you're logged in, you have a workbench for all of your projects. That's one way. The other way is inside of the terminal using our command line interface. And the other way is the dashboard that we created just for this button presses project. So here we are at the workbench. And you can think of the workbench as kind of a query designer. It lets you go through your data, make a bunch of, essentially run queries, but then it also helps you take those queries and embed them on dashboards or get URLs so that you can bookmark them or run them at any time. All keen queries you can actually represent in a URL, so they're fairly transportable that way. So let's run a very simple query. I'm going to refresh this page really quick to make sure that it's reflecting the fact that we have a button presses collection, and sure enough, we do. So I will go ahead and choose that from the dropdown, and then it's asking me to put in an analysis type. And there are a bunch of analysis types that the Keen API supports. Some count, average, percentile are a few of them. I won't get into that too much, but there are just a variety of analytics-focused operations that you can perform against the data, and they're kind of group come within that analysis type notion. So I've gone ahead and chosen count here. So that's all I have to fill out. Just here's the collection, here's the analysis I want to run, and then I just click run query, and voila, it comes back and it tells me that there are 2 events in this collection. So that's pretty good. I hit the button twice as far as I remember. So we have 2 events, and that's great. There are 4 tabs over here. The first one is visualization, that actually shows the nice representation of the data. If we had done different types of queries, there might be a line chart there, or a pie chart, or a bar chart. The second tab is JSON. This is just the raw JSON that the API returned for this type of query. So it's basically just the number 2 as a value to a key called result. So if you were to just on the command line do a curl query, or do a curl request to the Keen API, this is exactly the JSON you'd get back. The third tab is JavaScript, and this is just pastable code to run that exact same query and put that visualization inside a DOM element on your dashboard or any page that you need to. And the fourth thing is just the query URL. So as I mentioned before, you can represent any Keen query inside of a query URL. Sometimes they can get a little long, and they do have, when there's JSON involved and other things, it's base64 encoded and URL escaped and stuff. But this one isn't too bad. We can actually just grab this query URL and open a new tab, paste it in, hit enter, and there we go. Move it over a little. You can see the result is 2, all the same. So there are a variety of different ways to run that query and get that information back. In addition to running the count query, we can do something called an extraction. And the extraction is going to let us look at the full event that we sent in. It's basically a way to get the raw data out. With Keen, you can always get all of your raw data out. Extractions are full fidelity. There's no sort of pre-aggregation or rolling up the data. Every single event you send in, you can get the exact same thing out. So you can think of extraction as kind of like a select query, and in its default, you can filter properties if you want to, but by default, it's kind of like select star. You're going to get every property for the event back. So we're still looking at button presses collection in the drop down. Analysis type is extraction. I'm going to go ahead and run that query again. And now the visualization has changed. It's a table that shows us all of our properties. If we switch over to the JSON representation, I think it's a little easier to look at the structure, sort of the nesting of the properties, and explain a little bit about the key namespace. But before that, here are two events. So the result is an array of length 2. Here's the color red in one, here's the color red in the other. Both are also size big. So both of those events look great. They have the right properties. The other thing that you're seeing in the event body is this keen namespace. And this is created for every event that comes in. It contains a timestamp, which is when the event was recorded. That's an overridable property. So when you're sending data in, you can specify keen.timestamp yourself. If you're loading historical data, that becomes very useful. Or if you're queuing things to batch upload later, the API is real time, but there are certain use cases where you might want to batch up events on your side for efficiency or put them in a background queue, but you want them to still reflect the time that a user did something or the exact time of an event. So for that kind of stuff, you use timestamp. And then created at is when we receive the event, and ID is just a unique identifier for it. So that's a little bit of the workbench. There are a lot of other kind of things you can do here. We have some really cool updates coming down the pipeline for it that'll let you do even more options, more specifying timeframes, more chart types, all that good stuff. But that's a workbench is a really simple way to just come in and design a query and make sure that the data that you're tracking is what you think it is. So the second thing that we'll look at is our dashboard. Because let's say that the point of our button presses project is we want to show the world sort of how many people are coming to press our button. We want it's not something where the people that want this information are going to log into Keen. No, we want to put it on a web page somewhere or a dashboard. Maybe it's you want to show your customers a certain view of some analytics or just sort of your internal team. So the way we do that is by putting this stuff on a dashboard. So if we flip over to button presses, and I go ahead and close my inspector and reload the page, now we can just on this page we can look at the data recorded about our button presses. There's two charts on here. One of them is just the number of button presses over time. Oh, I think I switched these headers. Sorry about that. This number of button presses over time is really this one on the left. It's what we call a series query or an interval query. And what the query is just for every minute, the number of times the button was pressed. And since I pressed it, looks like about 5 minutes ago or something like that, we see a big spike where I pressed it during these 2 minutes and now nothing is happening. If I go back here and I press it again, and then I come back to the dashboard, what we should see is that sort of a third button press. Give it a second. Let it reload. Okay, so there's the button press that I just did. And sure enough, if we flipped back over to the workbench and counted the number of button presses, then we should get 3 now, and we do. So, and the second graph over here on the right side is a pie chart, and it is just saying, what are the colors of the button presses. So it's basically a count query, but it's grouped by that color property that we sent in. So we also want to briefly look at the source code behind this. The layout here is actually from is a template, and it's from a project that we launched just last week called Keen Dashboards. It's here on GitHub, and you can go see it. It has basically these grid-based responsive dashboard templates, and you can grab any of them and modify the HTML and then end up with a nice, easy to maintain dashboard that will work on mobile, it'll work on web, it's responsive. You can do all, and it's fully customizable. It's just HTML and CSS, and it's based on Bootstrap. So if you're already comfortable with Bootstrap, then there'll be, no surprises at all. Cool thing, Keen Dashboards is the #1 trending repository on GitHub yesterday. I think it still is right now on github.com/trending. So we've been super excited about this. It looks, we're always been frustrated about how hard it is to build dashboards, even to build dashboards for some of our own stuff. And so we tried to create this project to make it easier. It's fully open source. You can go clone it and play with it and everything. But coming back to our example, it's built on that dashboard framework, so you can see a similar styling. If we look at the code behind it, there's basically some Bootstrap grid code and some places where I've gone in and like added chart titles and everything. But overall, there's not a whole lot to it. Most of the interesting stuff is in this file dashboard.js. And what this file is doing is actually running the queries to get that data and then putting them into those HTML containers. So very briefly looking at this, just like when we're sending in data, we're creating a Keen client object. Now, instead of initializing it with a write key, we're initializing it with a read key. And that's what's letting us get access to that data. Again, if you remember that if you put a read key on a web page, then that data is going to be accessible to anyone with that key. When data is more secure, host that web, when it's not meant for everybody, you should always host your dashboards inside of a password protected admin tool or a VPN or somewhere that only your team can see. Or again, if your goal is to show these, show your dashboards publicly or to your customers, you can do some proxying, or you can use this thing we call scoped keys. If you look around in our API documentation, that's just at keen.io/docs, then you'll see basically how to deal with all those security things. But anytime there's give an example with a read key, I always want to caveat that with, if only put that out there publicly if that's your intention. Otherwise, there are a couple of different methods that you might otherwise try to keep things secure. So anyway, once we have our Keen client, everything else is pretty easy. We create a query object. It's a new Keen query. It's a count. That's our analysis type. We're going to count the button presses collection, and we're going to group it by color. And then we're going to draw it. We're going to put it into a pie chart. Here's the DOM element that's inside of that dashboard template that we're going to put it in, layout cell 2. And we're going to give it a couple of colors, red and blue, just because our button presses were red and blue, and that makes it easy to understand. Well, our button presses was red. I haven't shown you the blue button press yet. That's coming up in a second. But yeah, this is our count, or like our query, and then our draw function for the just the group by, just the pie chart. And then the line graph is very, very similar. We have a couple of different properties for the query itself. The interval, which is basically for every part of the line chart, like every increment, how much time is that? So valid ones are minutely, hourly, daily, weekly, etc. And we're saying a time frame, this 30 minutes, that's a shortcut. The API understands this kind of shorthand. So you can say this 30 minutes or last 24 days, last 24 hours, last 30 days. That's exactly how far to go back. And then we're drawing that inside of the other thing. So basically, we were able to create this button presses dashboard. Oh, okay. This button presses dashboard by grabbing a template, and this is all the HTML really there is to it. Very little, not much of it we had to change. And then just by a simple JavaScript file that's running those queries based on the data we sent in and throwing them into the dashboard. So pretty simple overall, I think, and it's still powerful. There are a lot of, obviously, again, this is just HTML and CSS. You could put a whole bunch of other stuff on this dashboard if you wanted to, whether it's sort of Keen query data related or if it's data from other sources. It's all fair game. You're not locked into one particular view. Okay, so moving on quickly, I want to show you the command line interface. So far, to recap, we've looked at, setting up a button for event collection. We click it, an event gets published. We've then looked at the data on a dashboard, and we've looked at the data inside of the workbench tool. Now we're going to look at the data inside of a terminal. So give me 1 second to resize this so you can see it. There we go. I'm a big Tmux and Vim user, so hopefully that's doesn't start any fights. Let's see here. Okay, great. So I've got a little split pane view here, and on the left is some of the instructions to get our CLI running, and then also to like what queries we want to run and how we're going to frame them. The first query we did on the workbench, and the first query we did on the workbench was just to count the number of button presses. So let's see what that looks like in terminal. It just looks like this: keen count -c, which is for collection, and then our collection name. So now we can count the number of button presses, and sure enough, we have 3. So that's great. We can also group that by color, just with -g, which is going to be for group by. Let me see if I can flip this layout. I bet it'll be a little easier to see. Okay, cool. So there we've gone and run a similar query. Now we're in terminal. We're working against the same data. The terminal here knows what project and what API keys we're querying against, because there is a .env file inside of this repository. .env is sort of a conventional place to put environment variables. It's a pattern, I guess, called .env and used in tools like Heroku's Foreman tool. It's just a nice way to keep your credentials for certain services inside of the project directory that you use them in. So alternatively, with the command line interface, you can specify the project. Like if the project ID was this big number, you can also specify that there on the command itself. But I always like to put the project ID and those keys inside my .env file to keep my the commands really short and sweet. So that's what querying in the CLI looks like. Now let's go ahead and press a button, sort of metaphorically, which basically amounts to adding an event. And if I go ahead and copy my command to do that from my notes, I'll bring it down here. And the command is keen events : add. Again, -c is collection name again, and here's button presses. And then -d is the data. So here we have basically the JSON payload. So the same way that we had, size big and color red, here we have color blue, and size is unknown, let's just say. So if I hit enter there, then that's going to send in that event. And once that's done, we get a JSON payload back from the API that tells us that that event was successfully recorded. And it was recorded, as we can see here, inside of the button presses collection. Now, if we go ahead and count our button presses again, we should have 4, and we do. And if we run that same query with grouping by color now, we should have 2 different groups, and we do. So we have blue, so we've pressed in quotes there, that button once, and then red, we've done it 3 times. So now we've looked at an example of sending in the data from both the browser and the command line, querying the data from the different sources. If we go back here to the workbench, we'll now have 4 button presses here. If we reload our dashboard, now our pie chart gets a little more interesting. We can see that 25% of the presses are blue and the others are red. And same thing for this other chart here, where we now have a blue button press that happened, and then mine from a few minutes ago. So speaking of that, that's pretty much an overview of the demo. I'll go ahead and flip back from the sharing and come back here, and I guess see if there are any questions about that. How did does that fairly easy to understand? Was what looked cool, what didn't? Go ahead and chime in, and we can chat about it.
Cool, guys. Do you have any questions for Josh?
So I was looking at Josh. This is Miguel or Michael or whatever you want to call me, Mike.
Hey, Miguel, Mike.
I was looking at your like Keen.io, right, and your pricing. How many? And there's a startup and sort of very early stage company price points, right?
Yeah.
About how many would you think, like on average, how many for a sort of a small site, startup site? I think it's 50. I'd have to look at it. But can you tell me if that,
Yeah.
in your experience, sort of works? Do you guys get a lot of pushback on that, or do you find that for most early stage companies who want to, sort of have more control over their analytics, that it's working? And
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
and then I would say, like, anything you would recommend in terms of on the development side, where you can group things in such a way to sort of keep your monthly events lower.
Got it. Yeah, sure. Those are both really good questions. On the pricing side, or on the sort of number of events side, yeah, the free plan goes up to 50,000 events, and then I believe the startup plan, which is I think $20 a month,
Yes,
that
sir.
goes goes up
100,000.
to 100,000. Got
Yep.
it. Yeah. So, again, it does depend on what you're tracking. If you're a startup and you're sort of iterating on a website or a mobile app, and you have, your 50 or 100 beta users, you're probably going to be very healthily under quota. If you're using, but maybe if you're building an API or you're using this to do like performance analytics, a very different bird, but also something that people do with Keen. Then you're going to be looking at how many API calls you want to instrument and which ones, and just depending on volume, you'll have, you'll be up against that 50,000 limit or not. We as far as pushback, I mean, so far we don't usually get a ton of pushback. It seems like, for developers and then for startups, at those price points, they're getting a lot of value out of it. That's not total events. That's new events you can send in every month, and there's no cap on retention. So, you can send in, you can have that startup plan and easily have 1 million events that are recorded, and, do not go over 1 million events are sort of recorded over a period of several months.
Awesome. And then what about, thank you for saying that. I was going to ask about that, if it was new monthly events each time. And then the other question was about how to best group these events, so you're not just bloating your analytics and losing potential data and having more events than you would otherwise.
Yeah, I think some of the tricks that I recommend are almost designing your dashboards or your reports or your metrics first, so that you have an idea of what you want to know, and then you can sort of restrict the events that you collect to to exactly what you need. You don't always know everything that you want to know in advance, so that can be a little bit tricky. But overall, there's always a temptation when you go and instrument something to instrument everything. And, again, if your volume is okay, or your cost-wise that makes sense, then that's totally cool. You can go and do that. But that also creates a ton of data that you might not really be sure how you want to work with. And so I find kind of being intentional up front about what you want to track, and what how that relates to the metrics that you really care about helps. And then the nice thing is there's no limit on properties. I mean, I think there's a theoretical limit that we might be like 1,000 properties, might be 10,000. But we definitely have people that send in events that are pretty big, and they're a single event. So in terms of quota, they're only one event, but they might have a ton of properties in them, and that might enable a lot of analysis in using one event that maybe you would have to use multiple events to do otherwise. So we generally always recommend to everyone take advantage of that fact that there's no limit on the properties. Usually it just makes all of the analysis that you can do better. The more state of the world that you capture along with the event, the more correlation you can look at later, the more like interesting things that you can pick out of the data. So an example is like if you're recording a user sign up, add a lot of properties to that, a lot of user properties, a lot of properties about the state of your system at the time. Maybe denormalize like the total number of users in the system at the time into another property so that you can correlate that later against certain types of people that are signing up. It's a kind of a contrived example, but generally wide events is a good strategy.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Yep, sure thing. Thanks for your question. All right, anybody else out there? More questions?
Josh, I'm just curious, can you talk a little bit more about the King dashboards that has been trending on GitHub recently? And for companies or apps that already have their internal dashboards already, would you recommend companies that like to switch over to using a template like this?
Yeah, good questions. As far as it's almost easier that second question that you mentioned around if a company already has an internal dashboard, and it kind of just depends on what how that dashboard is working for them, if they're happy with it, and kind of what the maintenance over time looks like. One thing that's nice about these dashboards is that they're pretty low. They're low effort for, I think, a lot of the value, like for the value you get out of it. But they're also actively being maintained by us and actively being maintained by the community. So they're just going to keep getting better and better. And the maintenance effort on your side of someone just using that dashboard gets lower. So I think there's if I look back and think about a lot of the admin dashboards I've built, they're just sort of the internal team stuff. A lot of it was kind of pretty, it was pretty janky, I guess you could say, because there's not really a lot of frameworks out there for it. I used to develop in Rails or develop in Django or Express or something like that. And, once you kind of go off the sort of restful nature of the thing that you're building, you get like the dashboards and stuff, they kind of become a no man's land, or at least a lot of the ones I've built have. And I don't enjoy maintaining that code, and then I don't do it very often if I don't enjoy it. So I think that there's potentially just a lot to gain in using something that's easier and is overall less effort and gets better. And the nice thing too is that you can makes it easy to get data from different sources into the same place. If you have a homegrown dashboard, usually you can do that too, but it might be a little bit easier in this case. So if some of the stuff you're tracking is with Keen, then maybe some other stuff you're tracking with a different service, or you just want to look at data from your own database, from your relational database alongside of your event data, you can definitely do that. And these dashboards make it, I think, easy to do that by being fairly open and not too prescriptive about what data is coming in and what the view of that data is.
Mm-hmm. Cool, thanks.
Yeah, definitely. And there are yeah, and as far as examples and things like that, just generally, I encourage anyone to visit Keen/dashboards. There's a README that points to the GitHub pages for that repo, and that has that shows you all the. I think there's 8 different layouts now. Just sort of how you're organizing the grid and what kind of what kind of data you're wanting to present. If it's a grid or if it's more of a hero type thing where there's like one chart that's bigger than all the others. You can see all the options there, and you can see examples of the layouts being used for more traditional use cases like web analytics or connected device analytics. You can see all of those, and they're not just the layouts, but they're populated with all the data and everything, and so they look kind of nice because they're pretty. They're sort of an ideal usage of those templates. So definitely head over and to Keen/dashboards and check those out. Might give you ideas on how to structure your dashboards or how to improve them, etc.
Great.